Welcome, everyone. My name is Curt Langlotz. I am director of the AIMI Center, and we are delighted to have you all here today for our conversation with DJ Patil. DJ,
thank you.
Great to have you.
Good to be here.
Yeah. So I want to tell you a little bit about DJ, and then we'll get right into the questioning. And we also have, for those online, Q&A. I've got my iPad right here, ready to look at your questions. And we have microphones that we can pass around the room. So be thinking of your questions. We'll spend 30 minutes or so, maybe a little more, just chatting, the two of us, and then we'll open it up for your questions and make it a broader conversation. So welcome again. A little bit about DJ. So DJ is a California boy, grew up in Cupertino, went to Monte Vista High School, De Anza College, UCSD, went on to do a lot of work in industry, led the product teams at Relate IQ, was a member of the venture firm Venrock Partners. He's held a number of roles at Skype, PayPal, eBay, was the chief scientist, chief security officer, and head of data products at LinkedIn. And then in 2015, the government reached out. He was appointed by President Obama to the position of Chief Data Scientist in the Office of Science and Technology Policy, where he led national data efforts here in the US. He established the mission of the office, which is to responsibly unleash the power of data for the benefit of the American public and maximize the nation's return on its investment in data. That led to the establishment of nearly 40 chief data officer roles across the federal government, led to the establishment of new healthcare programs, including Precision Medicine Initiative, Cancer Moonshot, and then reforms across other industries, criminal justice reform, including the data-driven justice and policy data initiatives. So we're delighted to have you.
Thank you.
More about your journey.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
All right, great.
It's also my shortest commute. This is great.
I wanted to start just by asking you about how you actually became the chief US data scientist. That's not a role, I believe it was a new role. And so how did that all happen?
Yeah, probably one of the things that I think we've all experienced, when you're a student, a researcher, in my case, I was a grad student looking for a problem, it was you're trying to figure out what can you do? And I was always really enamored by what you could find in early data sets. One of the first projects I ever worked on was a data set for the sardine populations off of California coast and why they collapsed. And in the process of that project, one of the things I first learned was, I was doing all this research in it, and then finally I couldn't figure out a problem. So I went to go find the people who actually created this data set. And what they told me was that the first few years, they had enough money where they were able to sample all the data at these regular intervals, and it was really well crafted. And then they kind of ran out of money, so then they tried to guess where the sardines were, and then they would sample that. And then I realized, it taught me one of the most important lessons, which is if you don't know who the owners of the data are and you can't understand how this got there, the data set often has this its own uniqueness, its own drift, whether you call that bias or problems, it's in there. And so when I was a grad student, I was trying to find what are other data sets where I wouldn't have as much of those kind of problems for a doctorate. I came across this one for around the National Weather Service. It opened up a large part of their data. And so I was just downloading all this data every night, processing it, trying to come up with interesting ideas around it. At that time, that was a lot of data. And what I finally discovered was these interesting patterns, and that led to what became known as a Maryland Ensemble Kalman filter, which is sort of one of the major ways of weather forecasting. But what that proved to me was there is something different than high performance computing, and it's the use of data in there. And ever since then, that has been kind of the thing that I've been most interested in, is how can you do that in companies and that side. Simultaneously, as this arc was going on, you saw political campaigns starting to use data in novel ways. You saw political entities, gerrymandering was starting to really be leveraged. In fact, the first version of MapQuest, the guy who built MapQuest, his original product was a general GIS technology. that was being leveraged by political parties. And he was so irritated about this that he was like, I need to prove to the world that there's something else useful for it. And so he put up this small project called MapQuest, and that's the thing that took off. So as it was happening, President Obama realized, like, wait a second, we're seeing a shift happen, and who is going to be responsible for this? So he created the first CTO, Chief Technology Officer for the U.S., and Anish Chopra took that job, and much of his approach was around data. The second US CTO, Todd Park, who built a company called Athena Health, which is electronic medical records, and was CTO for HHS, Health and Human Services, also very focused on data. So when Megan Smith took the third US CTO office, they said, hey, wait a second, this job actually is multiple jobs now, and the data component of this needs to graduate. And so that became the chief data scientist role. And because I'd been helping out so much and was also in the running for the CTO role, they said, guess what? This is now your problem. And so it was a real joy to take that on. And that job, by the way, it's not a Democrat Republican thing. The Trump administration was very focused on finding a person for this role. They were not able to fill it. But President Trump did sign into legislation the law that makes a chief data officer, every federal agency has to have a chief data officer. So this is actually very bipartisan. And now Denise Ross has the role, and she is fantastic and led many of our criminal justice initiatives during our time together in the Obama administration.
That's great. So it sounds like, we think today of the world of data and algorithms, and the balance has kind of shifted toward the importance of data with machine learning. It sounds like you were pretty early on that journey back when you were thinking about sardines and weather and so forth.
Well, part of it was because I think on the algorithm side, we had done such a good job, and we're just getting those compute infrastructure, the pseudo cloud, the Beowulf computational frameworks, those localized, very high performance compute. I mean, the symbolic systems was like Curt, your major, like you were pre that, but
that reminds me of something from the 80s.
Right, like that was that era of like, hey, wait, we're doing this
all
thing.
About the algorithm then.
But then we hadn't gotten the data hadn't caught up to make those algorithms super effective. And then we realized, wait a second, we've got this, we don't have the storage environment, we don't have ways to move around the data. And then I think the real breakthrough, honestly, was 9/11 moment. And then we realized, hey, we're not able to find signal in the noise. That's a data problem with computation. We had many of the computation elements. We did not have the data, or we did not have a way to put the data together in a useful way. And then you take those people who were in national security. A lot of us came out here to Silicon Valley, and we said, well, you guys have lots of data. Wow, we should be able to do something interesting with that data. And most of the time we over-index to ad targeting, but so much more of the data products were built out actually not in line of that. There was, like recommendation systems, other types of ways to add value.
Interesting. So then you joined the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and tell us a little bit more about what it's like to make policy as a data scientist at that level. You must have had some really interesting conversations.
You do. There's the White House is this very strange place. There's no instruction manual of here's how you do your job. Your job is to just advance the mission a little bit more every day. So usually the day starts off, the way we joke about it is it starts off with 2 hand grenades rolling into your office every morning. Your job is to diffuse them so you can go on to the next problem. And President Obama was very adamant about this. I saw this when I served also in the Bush administration, that it was do not let the urgent get in the way of the important. Do not let the urgent get in the way of the important, because there's something always urgent. But that prevents you from going after the long, big problems that you're supposed to be there for. And so what you have to do is first come up with your rubric for what problems you're going to choose. How are you going to get the rest of the policy councils to buy in? Just because you're chief data scientist doesn't mean you're well, I'm going to take on world peace. It doesn't work that way. You have to go get the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, Domestic Policy Council, the president has to be on board, and they're kind of collective. It's a collective policy process. So what were the big issues? Our rubric was, does this problem impact more than $1 trillion of US spend? Does it impact 1/2 of the population? Or does it help advance a group that has no recourse? And so inside that bucket, you would think first, you think of it as a small diameter set of issues. It turns out it's pretty big once you start getting creative. So for example, in there, healthcare is easy. Criminal justice, when you tie criminal justice with evictions and people spiraling down into poverty, all these things become in there. But there's other ones that are really trivial that people don't realize. Like, how do we think about a census for transgender? How do we think about the question around, when we love to talk about AI and radiology and the impacts like that. Yet when you go through this scanner at the airport, it can't distinguish between a threat because someone has a gender that's ambiguous to it. And so these machines are not built with dignity in mind or from a next level appreciation of what does good security shouldn't rely just on your gender. That's a kind of a stupid thing. It does not treat Black women with certain hair types respectfully. It does not treat transgender people who are born as female and identify as male appropriately, and vice versa. So there's a lot in there where we're not what do we do? How do we actually get those things in place? And then a lot of it also comes down to is policy is talent. Policy is not determined because you write it down. How many times have we seen legislation get written, but then nothing happens? It's done by those. Government is those that show up. And I'll just share this quick one because I think it's just indicative of how I would love for all of us to think. Is my wife and President Obama had a negotiation about what I should do, which was very awkward because when he was trying to convince us to take the job and move the family, and my wife asked why should we do this when it's going to disrupt the kids? You're about to have the midterms. Crimea was just happening. Ebola was happening. It was a really tough time for the presidency. And he just simply said, if your husband's as good as everyone says he is, he's going to make the better country for your kids. And you're like, dang, that's why.
hard to say no to
exactly.
that.
But okay. I honestly think of that way for all of us.
Yeah.
Is we're all doing something in our ecosystem. And if we take on some role where we're helping shepherd that policy or help shape something, that's actually how policy gets done. And so a lot of my time was spent recruiting, building up the US digital service, building up technology transformation service, getting these chief data officers in there, making sure that many of the rank and file and the intelligence apparatus, the data scientists that are there, had the ability to do their job rather than all the friction of using open source, stupid things. But there's also some real security things in there too. But all these components, making people who want to do their job able to do their job.
Yeah, so that's really powerful, right? That you're recruited to the White House by President Obama, and you have potentially all of these data assets across the United States, and you've prioritized certain kinds of issues that are going to have a broad impact. So maybe choose one. Maybe since we have a health group here, choose a health issue and kind of tell us a little more about how you decided to prioritize a health issue and within health.
Well, the easiest one that comes to mind, because it's health in the biggest initiative, was President Obama's Precision Medicine Initiative, which is now the All of Us campaign inside National Institutes of Health, also combined with the Million Veterans Program, MVP, at VA, which Curt, a bunch about also. And the part there that I think was, how do we get focused? And this gets to, why should the chief data scientist be in charge of this versus, Francis Collins, who's the head of NIH, but also instrumental in, figuring out how to decode the human genome, projects like that. Why wouldn't you have someone more medically trained or active in biomedical? And President Obama had this really interesting insight. He said, people who are in our computational space or tend to come from backgrounds like mine tend to end up always in national security, because the national security apparatus already knows how to utilize people with our skills. People in the healthcare system don't get access to the technologists first. It's too hard to understand what happened or understand the dynamics. There's a language barrier between the worlds. It's just like this place. And so his approach was, well, how do we make this really wildly different? Well, and he specifically at that point said, I do not get to work on any national security things, which did change later. But at that point, he said, you do not get to do any of that. And your first priority is figuring out, how do we actually enable a world of genomic medicine for every American?
So let me understand that more. So normally we think of these kinds of activities as collaborations between domain experts and technology experts. And certainly that's true in healthcare. And somehow it's easier in national security because the domain is simpler for a technology person to learn. Is that the issue? Or
so one way to think about it is national security, especially in end of World War I, World War II, who saved the day at the end of the day? It's the nerds, like Bletchley Park and cracking codes,
right.
The Manhattan Project in the nuclear age, large-scale kinetics, machining. The function of DARPA-esque entities in the military have a very, very close collaboration of general technology and have invested very heavily in technology. Medical and biological sciences have often been off on their own, and they don't get the benefits of interdisciplinary by the funding structures and the way it is. It's kind of like a university system. It's like, here's one building, math. Here's another building, computer science. Maybe they interact because there's, student crossover. But by the time you get to the medical school, it's really hard to draw these in. And so we have a fundamental problem in this country, and this is something that's coming up for all of us, is what does interdisciplinary collaboration really look like? And when I say interdisciplinary collaboration, what is collaboration between computation and medicine or medical schools look like right now? It's like this. This is like, here's the computational people, and they're like, yeah, we get to play a little bit. And then there's like the medical, like who's the alpha in the fight? There's an unbelievable imbalance in what that collaboration looks like. When you look across other areas, say building a nuclear reactor or other areas, it's much closer. There's people who are domain experts, but they're pulling in other people much more evenly. Department of Energy funding or DoD, they're much more on par as talking as equals. So in medicine, like, there was this one where you kind of, and this has been happening many times over, is people kind of go, that like a medical school will say, oh, this is our supreme computational environment. And you go, you don't put it next to a glacier? Like, how do you handle the cooling? And then you realize like, oh, this is a tiny computation environment. Mm-hmm. The data sets aren't really thought of with the same level of creativity that we've seen elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So the approach has been that we need, and why do I say this so emphatically? If you look at what other countries are doing, it's easy to pick on China, and we can go more into that in detail about how I think about that, or I think we should broadly think about that. But China is basically taking this approach and saying, you know what, let's rewrite the entire way we think about the academic sector, every 5 to 10 years. Just wipe it clean and redo it. Like, these departments are now one department, or these 3 departments are one. And we have locked in, which gives us tremendous amounts of leverage in certain ways, but it really hurts us interdisciplinary wise.
It's interesting you say that, because as you know, our conversation today is sponsored by the Center for AI in Medicine and Imaging in the School of Medicine. And I think, I guess I have a little bias here, but some of our secret sauce is that we have the computer science department is literally right across the street. And so those kinds of relationships are easier here than perhaps in some other places. But I think you're right about the barriers you described. Yeah.
Like, even if we think about it as how does a university collaborate? It's mostly through the students. Mm-hmm. And if the students aren't cross-pollinating, it's really hard to figure out how to do it. It's like, if somebody in the computer science department is going to get an NIH grant, yeah, good luck with that.
Yeah.
And how is somebody from the medical department supposed to get an NSF grant or a DOE grant?
Right.
So this is where, like, what's been our solution federally? It's been the DARPA-S programs, or the new DARPA-H function that's going to exist at the National Institutes of Health. That's been our mechanism. Those are small, tiny dollars, small effort compared to what the big overall funding apparatus is and where we need to go as a country.
So getting back now to sort of health initiatives at the federal level, tell us how, in the setting of the NIH and all the other health initiatives that the federal government had, the VA, how does a data scientist influence health policy at the federal level?
So the first, honestly, is you show up and you try to convince people to talk to you, because I remember at this moment I visited the VA facility in Boston, at Jamaica Plains, and I just showed up, and then I caused all this problem because they're like, you're the White House showing up to this one hospital to check out what's going on. They're like, because everyone's very scared. Like everyone's like, oh, so you have to build trust, and trust is a human thing. It doesn't work because somebody just gave you a title. The title can help open the doors. It can help shut down doors, but the goal is to actually figure out how do you broker trust. And so the first part of that was, how do you actually get to know what are the problems that are actually going? What is limiting the ability to make forward progress for this team? And when I say forward progress, I'm not thinking like the framework we use is what's required to double the impact in half the time. Like we want to be on a logarithmic schedule of delivery. And one of the points that was there as we're looking at this, they said, we've already invested a lot of money in these different programs. Is there a way to actually get these things to collaborate? Can we learn from each other? And what oftentimes is fascinating from the role of the White House, a lot of times you're like, you and you should talk together, like, because they're in their own little, deep inside their own bureaucracies. They didn't even know that somebody else is doing this. And so you kind of try to say, can you create a coalition of the willing? Can you bring all these people together under this auspices? And what you're doing is, and this is just like a university program, these are excuses to get together. So the Precision Medicine Initiative, Cancer Moonshot, basically gave permission for people to say, I'm going to go spend time on this. And now all I had to do was figure out how to convene them, how to bring them together. And then collectively could say, they're facing a roadblock. They're like, they have consent issues that they need to have resolved. Over here, we have basic computational issues. We don't have industry partnerships. Well, how are we going to make sure that we have ethics involved in this? And so I got to play a little bit, almost a role of product manager, as I was just trying to do this, because you don't actually have authority. Like, the authority of these agencies is to Congress. The presidency is a bully pulpit. And so like Cancer Moonshot, we're able to get all the secretaries together, but all I'm doing with all the secretaries is basically for them to say, when I call, your people need to pick up the phone and make sure they can have the ability to show up.
So let's focus on maybe some specific data issues. So you mentioned all of us. There's the Million Veterans Project. And then let's talk about the VA's electronic health record system. I'm sure that many in our audience would love to get their hands on some of these large data sets to build machine learning algorithms and improve the care of patients. There'll be different perspectives and different access to those, but maybe explain a little bit about how those were created and why there may be differences in how we think about those data sets.
Sure. So the easiest is to say Million Veterans Program is one of the core inspirations for the broader precision medicine, all of us initiative, like that UK Biobank, many of the others that have come along with that. Those are inspirations. Like, you're trying to build off of these other components and pull them in together.
And maybe just give a brief description of what it is. Yeah.
So Million Veterans Program project is what it is basically they got all these veterans. The goal was 1 million. And they said, we want to get a biosample from you because we have all this electronic medical records from the VA. And if we do that, we'll have a giant biobank. And from that, we should be able to learn lots of interesting things, and we'll be able to help our veterans. That's the mission of the VA. They weren't thinking, they obviously are back of the brain thinking more broadly, but their primary focus is what can we do for our veterans? And so as they're doing this, they ran into a few things that are a challenge. One, they got the medical records. That's actually the easy part. The harder part was, wait, we got to consent people. So how are we going to consent people? What does that look like? And so they got to do all this assessment to try to figure out what is it going to take to get a veteran to sign up. The amazing thing is they talk to the veterans. The veterans, they're asking questions like, do you want to review your data? Do you want, revoke it? All these other things. The veterans, interesting, were like, we don't care. Just do not allow this data to be sold. Make sure this data is going to be used to benefit another person who's a veteran in the future. No strings attached.
And I think that is a common theme when you talk to patients, any kind of patient, right, about using their data. Often they will say, in an altruistic basis, right? I'm happy to have this as long as it's treated securely and the right kind of ethical considerations are taken. They're more than willing to help.
That's right. It was all about help. But VA also was running this thing of like, they've got all these biosamples and they can't sequence them. They don't have the infrastructure to do this. They don't have what's called a trusted internet connection, a TIC, which is legislated as a way to move this data around. And so they have all these little micro issues that are there. And then also the way the consent is written, that data can't easily get moved to the NIH. And so it can't be part of that portion of the direct contribution. And there's all these rules, many of which are laws also, that are, or parts of it are in law, that the VA CIO's interpretation says, sorry, researchers, we can't give access to it. So then it becomes a water against stone thing of like, well, we're going to just keep pushing on this issue and try to ask, what if we did it this way? What is it this way? Can we bring researchers in? Can we get an environment? Well, is there a way to move this data to the Department of Energy where we have the national labs and they have these environments? Can we leverage that to get it? And so that's where we started to have to get very creative to find possible solutions to problems that would be, and many of you who have tried to get access to this data would be like, why can't you just figure it out? And there like one of the things, whenever you're frustrated around one of these things in government, you have to ask a lot of times, well, two things. One, can you show me specifically the line where it says I can't do this? Like, show me the actual rule, because a lot of times it doesn't exist. And then finally somebody's like, oh yeah, okay, it doesn't exist, and then you can do it. The second is, a lot of times there is a very good reason behind it, but that reason may not directly apply in this situation, and people can't see. They're seeing in like 16-bit color versus 32-bit color, and so like you get that challenge, and it's our job. Honestly, getting frustrated doesn't help. What helps is finding ways to help that person who owns the problem see why that if they align with you and there's a way to do it, it's a win-win.
Great. So let's, at this point, move more towards the future. Okay. So we have these data sets now. Some of them are, put together places like here, academic institutions that have healthcare organizations. Some of them are federal. And we have this incredible explosion of this new industry of machine learning. Where do you think that industry is going? And what do you think the role these data sets will have in AI, I guess you could say, the AI industry generally?
Yeah. So I'm super bullish and super concerned simultaneously. So on the part that's super bullish, I think about, these data sets where a student, when I was a grad student, just trying to play around with a bunch of data to find out something interesting, what might they discover in there? all the appropriate controls, all the assume all the safety, all the right stuff is in place. But one of the ones that I thought was fascinating was when we were looking at sort of what some of the questions is, the VA data set, no one has really asked or looked at that data set about Lyme disease. There is no large data set at that scale across the country to just even get the beginnings to understand something basic about Lyme disease, just because no one has asked. And I remember calling up the VA about this, and I was like, has anybody actually ever, they were like, oh, no one's asked that question. And I'm like, that's why you open up data. That's the exact reason. Somebody may have a harebrained thing. So finding those things out there. I think about the rare diseases and the ability to be creative for some of those things. I think that's out there. And then the other side, I think, which is there, which we have to be honest about, is if you look at the VA data, obviously it's got a strong bias function because the military has been mostly male up until recently. It also has a very strong bias function on ethnicity. That's changing, but it's just still there. We also know we are in a massive geopolitical race for the next set of pharmaceutical drugs, the next set of cures, the way whole pharma is going to go. And this is predominantly becoming a race between Western countries and China. Now, India is a little bit in the mix. There's a little bit in Brazil as well. But it's predominantly that for what does the next era of medicine look like? And that, what I honestly think about all the time is the people that I've gotten to meet where you talk to them and they hear about the pace of science and they tell you about the pace that they won't live to see even the first phase of our work done. And what they are trying to do to take medicine research into their own hands because they have no alternative. And I know I'm preaching to the choir because many of you are on the front lines taking care of these people. What I have seen is that we have to figure out what can we do in novel ways to massively accelerate the progress for research to take place.
Yeah, I think as we all see the opportunities to apply these and improve care, it's immense, and it's kind of an obligation in a way to apply them.
Right. Well, obligation is a really good and important word because if we're asking somebody for their data, what is our obligation? Obviously, we think of most of the obligations like treat it safe, keep it with respect. Yeah. Those are important. Mm-hmm. What about our obligation to use the data? Yeah. They gave it on a promise that we would do something on behalf of them, if not for them.
Yeah. And I wanted to highlight your comment about Lyme disease. It just reminds me of this interdisciplinary nature that we've been talking about, and that in some ways we're transitioning perhaps between work that looks at what data do I have available to decide what problem to solve versus asking someone who's on the front line saying, what are the problems that really are important to you? And that may be one that a data scientist might not think about, but a clinician who's treating patients might think about to lead the data scientist in a direction of solving a really important problem.
To emphasize that problem, the way you stated it, is about to become 100x more important. And the reason why is as we start to get to some of these large language models, we're going to get to scientific results that we're like, so what's the question for this? We're not going to actually understand where the result is coming from. We're going to see this result and it's like, how should we think about this? So it's like kind of the classic hitchhiker. It's like the answer is 42, but what's the question?
Well, that gets to the black box nature of some of these things. There's a lot of good work going on in there. How do we discern how these algorithms are making their decisions, and how do we make them more transparent and explainable AI, for example?
Yeah, but I even think now, even with the AlphaFold results, like being able to sequence all these things, this is going to take a while to understand, what is it? Are there certain things that are, just natural across all these things? Are there certain structural components? Are there certain things that are that hold true across all these things, or are there the differences, and why are they different? Mm-hmm. So even though we've got an algorithm that can give us kind of the results and solve this problem, the nuances around the path. It's like almost like you jump to the end of the book, but you didn't read through the book, so we don't know the actual ways to get the next set of insights that often are critical as we move this from result to actual implemented healthcare.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. I want to highlight before we start taking questions from the audience, you have done some work and written a short book on the ethics of AI and data science, and wanted to hear your thoughts on what you see are the key ethical issues that you encountered in the government and that you think are facing us all.
Yeah, so thanks for bringing that up. There's a few things that I thought I understood some of these issues, of a time with regards when I was going into these problems. I did not appreciate this at the scale of the country and internationally. And in fact, it was actually the credit I really give this to helping me see this was President Obama. And during the building of precision medicine, he had one crisp order to us. And that was, when we're building this, make sure the people that are impacted are at the table. And I remember we had come back with an assessment and we were kind of discussing next steps, and President Obama brought up like who's at the table. We said, here's this group and they represent this problem, and this group represents this problem, and kind of walked him through that. And he said, so where are the people that actually are impacted? Where are they? And then that's the opening line. When a president asks you that, you're about to get your ass handed to you. Like, it's just like you just know it. And he was absolutely right.
And in the health world, that's the patients often who aren't necessarily a part of the research teams.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
We don't have the patients there. And when we got out there and really met the patients, we really came away with a very different perspective about this. And the All of Us campaign, I think, has done a really good job to kind of incorporate those elements. But that first part of that, the way I would say that is, the first thing is the data points have names. You have to get out there and know them. The criminal justice work that we're doing, one of the most important things for me was Lynn Overman, who was on my team then and is back at the White House running a huge number of critical programs now. She's like, do you actually know what jail is like? I was like, no, I can't say that I do. It's like, well, we're going to go visit a jail.
Yeah.
And so, we spent a bunch of time talking to inmates, talking to people there, talking to the correctional guards, like everybody, and came away with a very different perspective as a result. So I think you have to know the names. The other portion of this, what I've seen is, as we're seeing a lot of energy come into fair algorithms, transparent accountability, all these different things, one of the things that we realized as practitioners is that we didn't know how to implement any of these things. And they weren't ready for what you might call prime time, drop it into a company that's building, or in our case, the case of building Devoted Health, which is a healthcare, we're a Medicare Advantage plan that takes care of senior citizens. And when we're doing that, we said, well, we need to create our own book of things that people on the team need to have. And so Hillary Mason, who's built a lot of data teams, myself, Mike Lukides, put together this book. And what we realized, the first set of things start with like diversity, but then there's sort of other things that we just forget to do. For example, red teaming. Before a product is launched, before a data set is launched, we set aside time to ask what are all the things that could go wrong, and then we have to have answers to those. And some of the answers may be like, we're going to have to watch this one real closely, but then now we're assigning that task to somebody who's responsible.
Yeah.
So things like that. The other part is like, what does it mean for recruiting? What does it mean to actually build teams the right way? What is it? Do we have all the processes in place? Is there a kill switch on these algorithms? A lot of these different components. And I need to be very honest. Like, there are systems out there. Like, there's a system that got built in the federal government for DACA recipients, people who've been brought over in the country. They have legal authority. Parents were illegal, but illegal aliens, but they grew up here. They didn't have a say in the matter, so they have protected legal status. There's a database for those people. In the design and the build of that database, none of us, including myself, ever suspected that that database would be potentially used to persecute that population, those group of people in the Trump administration? What should we have done?
Right.
Well, that was not on our red team list.
Yeah.
Probably now, in retrospect, we need a more sophisticated red team list. But what we should have had is, what happens is if this data needs to be destroyed, what's the right thing to do? How do you go about doing it? Where are the controls? All those things. That should have been on the table.
Yeah.
And so what I share that story to really push all of us to realize the power we hold. And sometimes when you're not in that role or not empowered anymore, where and what that data can be used for, and how do we put those protections? Because fair, transparent algorithms, all that stuff, that's going to be important. That's coming. Let's keep investing in it. But we need another set of things now, and that is process oriented.
Yeah. Yeah, and we face that in healthcare quite a bit, where, if the wrong data type gets sent to an algorithm, what happens? Does the right thing, does it know that it really shouldn't be operating on that data? Those kinds of things, very important.
Right. So
those red team kinds of notions.
What happens if your data is subpoenaed?
Yeah.
Right. Like, we're entering a different era. What if DOJ shows up with a FISA? This is a type of warrant that basically is a national security one. You can't really talk to them about it. You're just kind of required to give it overhead unless you have clearances. Then you can talk to them. In those cases, what are we going to do? And in our case, we actually got the DOJ to agree that under statute, like, these things are off the table for biobanks. This is not acceptable for criminal justice to get engaged or to do anything in this space.
All right, so just to finish, I want you to tell the story. I know that you were apparently instrumental in the term data scientist and how that got created.
Yeah.
So I want you to tell the story at LinkedIn as to how that actually happened.
So the way data scientists came about for us, or the version that is at LinkedIn, people often think like LinkedIn and all these other social media companies at the time were like fiercely, like, we never talked, we didn't collaborate. There's actually a huge amount of collaboration. Jeff Hammerbacher, who was running the Facebook data team, he was here in Palo Alto. We'd get together in lunch and compare notes, like, what technology is working, what's not working, like recruiting. We're very fierce recruiting, going after the same talent. But we were also very focused on trying to find ways to build. And one of the things I asked Jeff, as I said, as we were coming up towards our IPO, is I said, hey, what are you calling your team? Like, what are you calling your people? And because HR is super pissed. They're like, we got too many job titles. Like, we have analysts to research scientists to all these things. They said engineers are engineers, designers are designers, sales are sales. Like, what are you people? And what's a career ladder? And so Jeff and I started to scratch out on a sheet of paper, like, what are we? And we're like, analysts sounded too Wall Streetish. Research scientists we had seen at Yahoo and other places had become a fiefdom that got separated from the company. The company was like, oh, those are the scientists, we don't talk to them. So that wasn't working. We were like, oh no. So what was there? And we had like a pretty long list, maybe 6 or 7 things. And then Jeff had this idea of data scientist, to which my honest answer was like, is that redundant? And like, maybe we're data, like analyst scientists, like analytics scientists. Like, we had a bunch of these variations. But I took it back to the team, and Monica Ragati had this great idea. She was like, as we were debating, she's like, we're LinkedIn. She's like, why don't we just post all the job postings with all the different titles and see where everyone applies? And I was like, this is like the greatest idea ever. And so she posted all the job postings, and guess what everyone applied to? The data scientist one, which wasn't the one we were exactly thinking that people were going to apply to, but that was the one that won. So then we became data scientists. Yeah. I think the question behind it is, why has that taken off? And it turns out data scientist has been used before. And it's sort of been a term that never had taken off. People had used it in literature. I mean, I think of the original data scientists as like the Mayans and the people ancient in Indus Valley who were doing Mesopotamia, who were doing all these calculations. Like, they're the real original data scientists. But in this case, it's taken off because social media companies were able to really show like you could actually get really big ROI, return on investment from data and investing in data. And that was not clear before. That was a huge leap of faith to see that happen, but to see it actually on the balance sheet changed people's perspective. The second one is, honestly, nobody really knows what it means. And the reason this is so important, like it's comical, but it's really important because if you go to a meeting and you're the business analyst and it's like a high executive meeting and then you're like the business analyst, they're like, why are you here? And they're like, oh, or what brings you to this meeting? And you're like, I'm the business analyst. They're like, this is a big meeting. You shouldn't be here. If you're the data scientist, they're like, oh, thank goodness, you're the data scientist. We need some smart brains here. And then once you're in the room, you have context. And when you have context, you can actually use your skills to impact the problem. And then suddenly they're like, we need more of those smart people. They just didn't realize that they were called the same thing. And so that feedback loop has been there. The joke we say is like to executives when we were trying to convince people why this is important was we'd say, who's your Spock in the boardroom? Like, isn't it crazy that you're working in these super high-tech industries and you don't have a Spock in your boardroom? That's crazy. And people go, oh, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
And so you just need, does it have to be a data scientist? Can it be somebody else? So for the Biden-Harris transition, I was a CTO, but also the representative for science. Mm-hmm. Because it wasn't a chief science person at that point, but I was like, oh, fine, technology science, at least we can provide coverage and I can pull the appropriate domain people in for policies for the first 100-day plans.
So that actually dovetails nicely with our first online question, and we do have microphones here. So those of you who have questions, want to just raise your hand, and we'll get the mics to you. But in the meantime, I have a question online from Leanne Summers who asks, and this is related. So when you're in the government policymaking room or the boardroom, how many times did you experience pushback, and how did you deal with that when bringing the coalitions together? In parentheses, feeling very vindicated by what's being said generally.
So this is a great question because pushback happens massively, but pushback doesn't happen to your face, and that's the problem. It's passive aggressive, and we need to acknowledge it is passive aggressive very differently based on gender and ethnicity and power dynamics. Very different, and so a lot of my time was to win before the meeting. So like I had a rule, like trying to figure out how do you get to people before the meeting so that they could kind of understand and help them. So like I wasn't catching them off guard. And so I'll share kind of a version of this that first from a perspective as the data person, but then also if you're what to do as the executive side. So from the data side, one of the things that happened is, so in the original policing meetings, I got to go and attend because I'm the chief data scientist. That doesn't mean I get to stay in the meetings. Like they'll move on. But the first time you show up, they're like, why are you here? Like, what's going on? Like, you don't like this is serious stuff. Like, you go with your data stuff, like go play over at NIH. This is policing, highly political charge. The president assigned a blue ribbon commission on all the things that need to be done to transform policing. And it was some large percentage of them involved technology. And so when that was starting to shift, I went to the team. I said, hey, team, have we thought about, we're going to give money and grants to people for body cameras. Who's going to pay the contracts for the wireless connection? Who's going to pay for the storage? What does the ethics look like for, who gets access to that? How are we going to worry about this thing at that point? We didn't have a word quite yet for deep fakes, but I was like, what happens if somebody sabotages stuff? And then very quickly they're like, can you come to the next meeting? And so you had to kind of jujitsu that. And one of the most important things with that dynamic was I was looking very specifically on each of those stakeholders. Is there a problem I can solve specifically for them from the way we are approaching our work? Because if I can solve a problem for them, we're going to be able to go better. The other part, honestly, is, and this I have to give a lot of credit to President Obama on, is he knew how to empower people in the room. And so there were many instances where he could see, like, as he called it, his nerds got isolated from the process. Like, it was like I remember kind of concrete. One of this is written in Jim Comey's book, so I can discuss it. Is Comey was the head of the FBI, was complaining about encryption and backdoors, and sort of complaining about the technologists and their approach, and why we sabotaged his ability to get backdoors in. And part of that was, you have the head of the FBI, you've got all these other people, very powerful people in the Situation Room arguing these things. And President Obama very astutely said, well, I've got my team, and he would empower those people. He'd call them out by name in those meetings. I've seen him firsthand do this. He'd say, hey, what do you think about this? And he'd give them voice. And when you give people voice in those kind of forums, you have to do it. Oh, I'll mention one other thing, because I think this was really, really powerful. Dennis McDonough, who was chief of staff for President Obama, was, I think, and will go down in history as one of the top 5 best chief of staff, not chief scientist. He was chief of staff. He'll go down as one of the best chief of staffs ever. Before the meeting, he would start by saying, remember, this is the meeting. There is no other meeting. And like, that was like a moment, and you're just outside the Oval Office, and you're like, oh, chill. Oh boy, have I prepared enough? Have I gotten enough? But it was like a strong signal to be like, there is no other passive aggressive crap that's going to be tolerated. You bring everything to the table now, and it gets resolved now, because there is no literal other meeting where this will get discussed. We are going from here.
Well said. Yeah.
It's been powerful.
Another question from online. We've seen a great deal of progress in leveraging, this is from Nick Shadid. We've seen a great deal of progress leveraging machine learning for healthcare diagnostics. What are your thoughts on the current state of machine learning to improve drug design and drug discovery?
Oh, Nick, great question. So I think we're honestly quite early. I think we're early for a couple perspectives. One, we still have not created the big data sets that we need to achieve this. We don't have the metadata on there. We don't have all the auxiliary. Like, I think a lot of times when we think about data, we think of, like, if you think about a muscle, it's like, here's your quadriceps, but we haven't thought about like anything else, like tendons, ligaments, bone. Like, we're like, it's a muscle. And so we have the one big data set, but we have none of the supporting infrastructure that allows that data set to be well utilized. That's one component. Like, we're starting to get there with all that supporting infrastructure for data to actually be used. Two is we really have to get some of these, open up the aperture to being more clever with the use of those technologies. That includes large language models. That includes just brand new techniques that people are playing with to find and understand things. And the biggest one of all is truly interdisciplinary work, like the work that's happening here, the work that you've been spearheading, Curt. Those kind of interdisciplinary approaches. And then there's another one that we're not talking about, which is, we have to be very honest with ourselves, is, does the public care? And if we're honest with ourselves, how does the public look at us right now, who are on this forefront of trying to do these things? They're like, great, another treatment that's going to be really slow, that only a small number of people are ever going to get access to, and is going to be priced outrageously. Or is this going to be another kind of opioid kind of thing? And there's a bunch of things that we're not talking about, and there's all those kind of things. So we like to often think, like, because we're in the academic sphere, we're in the rare purified air of all these things. The public is not with us in the way that I think we want it to be, and we need it to be. COVID vaccines have shown this. There's still an incredible amount of distrust. There's a lot of challenges of just collecting this data, and we need to find ways to bridge that. And that's not going to be just us talking down to the public. We are going to have to get into those communities, many of which have been hurt and harmed, or do not get access to the care like they deserve. That's going to take a different approach. We need to make a different level of promise and commitment to them for all of this whole component of drug discovery, AI, machine learning to work. Otherwise, we're going to do awesome with a small set of things, and we'll get some great papers, and we'll get like a New York Times, sort of story, and it'll look great. But will you actually, how long will it take you to save a life? How long will it take to actually be the benefits that you feel really good about? Like it doesn't have to take as long as it currently is on track to.
And it gets back to what we were saying earlier about getting patients involved or the public involved in all of these activities.
That's right.
Right, not just multidisciplinary.
Yeah. Who's the biggest advocate when you do these things? Like if you do this work, you don't want to advocate. Like if you are advocating, you're losing. You need the people in that community to advocate for you. They need to pull you in. When they speak with their voice, that works. Like I hate to say it this way, this is a populism. This is a populism argument that we have failed in science to leverage. If the population demands it and wants more science, they will get more science. We have not done that. And the people, last time I saw this done most effectively is the work that's created the National Cancer Institute, those type of programs. The reason organ donation, the part of the reason organ donation, at least kidney dialysis is a great example. Kidney dialysis gets paid at the federal level versus other things. Why? Because people were very effective, brought a person in and showed them what dialysis looked like on the floor of Congress. And they said, oh my God, that's outrageous. We should fix that. That's how you unlock federal dollars to solve problems, by that storytelling, that narrative, rather than us just kind of describing things in this broad strokes that we do.
Great. In our waning minutes here, let's take a couple questions from the room. Go ahead.
So, fabulous ideas on the way we should do things. We have about 120 people online and 60, 70 here. What are the top 3 or top 5 projects, not just technical projects, but initiatives that you think the smart people in this room should be pursuing?
Yeah. So the first one I would say is make a commitment to meet 100 people in communities you have no exposure to, where they live. Meet 100 people over the next couple years. Just 100. Pick some target, but not some groups, like not just a group, but actual people. Meet them at their religious organizations, meet them in the field, meet them at, we love to champion essential workers. Go meet them. That's one side. 2, really ask, what does it take to solve an interdisciplinary problem? Imagine that we had a new moment in time where you could pick your favorite analogy. It's like the president says, who do you want on your team? And you can pull anybody to solve a problem. You can pick any single person. You have first round draft pick across the entire country, across the world to solve a problem. It's like our version of going after to save humanity against an asteroid coming at us kind of thing. Figure out what are those disciplines and ask what would it take to build that team, and then start putting that together to go on and take on a project. Could be open source, could be here in an academic project, could be anything, but look at the problem from that perspective. And the reason I say it, even though that it doesn't have that much as the specificity that you want, is because you can take that approach and can say, what is it going to take to actually super jump or leapfrog using models to go after drug discovery? I think those kind of approaches, because what you want is sort of the small little ligament fascia thing of the big muscle that's going to actually unlock the magic. Like you need that portion. And then the other problem that I think which is there is on the pure research front, the ones that I'm super interested in is asking, well, I'll give 2. One is reproducibility of scientific experiments. What does that look like? And then the second one is, as we're starting to get the data sets together, what are better approaches, more clever ways to say, oh, we already have the answer in the data set. We just never knew to ask the question. Kind of the one we were talking about, like Lyme disease, like we already have it. The answer's waiting, sitting there. It's like, for those that remember Vioxx, if you look at the clinical signature, it was like, oh, wow, this is like, duh, this is a problem. Except, of course, in my opinion, we took a pharmaceutical that could be beneficial for a lot of people off the table because we went too far. But what are those problems that are already, we have something and out there? I think some of the work that I think about is also, are there I think like one of the ones, just to cite a person, is some of the lines of work that Matt Might is doing. out in Alabama that is kind of looking at drugs that are already out there that can be repurposed for other solutions, off-label use, those kind of things. And then the final one, which I would put out there is problem specific, is ask yourself if you are if there's a layer of things that you're specifically frustrated on, what would it look like if you lent some time to the federal government or the state government to actually help them write the plan for what it should look like? Should this be, maybe it's a white paper, maybe it's a call for information, it's a bunch of, and Nigav, you did a bunch of this for like as people were formulating policy. Also, full credit for Nigav, like he helped us a ton during the California COVID response to actually help our thinking on these things. But ask yourself and start, like maybe here's another way to frame it. Build 10 connections across county or state. Doesn't have to be this county, that doesn't have to be the state. Build 10 connections with somebody who's in some kind of government role that if you help them out on, they could call you and be like, hey, I don't know how to think about this. What should I do here? Build that relationship now, because that's like, people always ask me, like, how did you get the call? How did you end up in that role? And it's like, well, I guess I had that relationship because I just tried to show up and help. And then stuff went sideways, so they didn't know who else to call. And then they're like, well, you're first. And then you own the problem.
DJ, it has been a great pleasure having you here today for this conversation. Thank you so much for all of your wisdom and thoughts today. And on behalf of the AIMI Center, I just want to thank our audience online and our audience here in the room.
Yeah.
We'll obviously be here. DJ will be here for a while if you have questions. I'm sure he's happy to answer them after our formal session. Thank you. And this concludes our session. Thank you again.
Thank you, Curt.
Okay.
Appreciate it.